Welcome back to 65 Drums. My name's Justin Greenwald, and this is the history of electronic drums.
It quite simply brings drums into the 80s.
All right, let's move ahead to Sonar. Yeah, I bet you didn't know that Sonar actually made some electronic drums back in the 80s. The German acoustic drum company made the Sonar Mammut digital drum system in 1987. There were a couple of different generations of pads with this system, but on the whole, they were 10 inches across, they were circular, and they had acoustic drum heads on top. Underneath that acoustic head, there was a 3mm rubber layer, and then a wood circle like on the Techstar pads from Tama, and then a 25mm piece of foam underneath that, and then finally the plastic shell. The Mammut module had ROM cartridges that you could insert to get different sounds. There was also the mini Mammut and the trigger stick. I'll leave a link on screen to an excellent website dedicated to the history of this brand of Sonar drums, which you can check out. Unfortunately, Sonar doesn't make electronic drums anymore. There were some delays during the making of these drums, and then when they finally came out in 1987, that was kind of the wrong part of the 80s to launch a brand new line of electronic drums. 1987 was the year that the DrumCat came out, although it may not have been widely available until 1988. Basically, Cat saw that the Roland Octopad came out and it was really popular, and they knew that it had a better form factor to sit next to an acoustic drum set than what they currently offered. So Bill went to the drawing board and came up with the DrumCat in 1987. It had 10 zones and inputs for 9 more pads. This was the most powerful, most versatile MIDI multipad of the day. However, it was also tougher to learn to use than the Simmons or Roland offerings. Versions of this pad are still being sold to this day. The list price back then was about $995. In 1987, Engineered Percussion, who would later change their name to Axis Percussion, introduced the E-pedal. Not many people really bought this one because it felt too light, but the company would later make a better, more successful version in 1990. I should probably also mention that Axis now owns DDT, which we'll talk about later on in the video. From its beginning in 1987 till now, Dawes has been focused on one thing: making really tough 6-inch rubber pads. It's a simple formula, but these pads have found their way into many famous drum sets over the years. Neil Peart used a custom version of this that had a shape of a target on it on one of his drum sets. Over the years, they've added a couple of different size options, and in 1995, they introduced the Dawes kit. Basically a bunch of these pads on a drum rack with no module for about $1,495. Also in 1998, Dawes would develop a drum set to be sold under the keyboard brand Kurzweil. From what I can tell of the company, it's all owned and run by one guy who makes all the pads by hand. And last I knew, in a semi-recent podcast, he was working on a wireless pad. Okay, so let's move ahead to another forgotten electronic drum company, Cheetah. This company released a drum set almost completely identical to the Clone Kit 2. You could say it's a clone of a clone, just a more sucky version. The company kind of flip-flopped on how the sounds were going to be produced. At first, the plan was just to make some software for the Sinclair Spectrum computer, but that idea was later scrapped. So instead, they released the Cheetah MD8 drum machine and the Cheetah P2M pad MIDI converter to feed the drum machine MIDI notes. You'd have to buy both to make the setup work, making the total cost about £350 if you bought everything. And by far the biggest downside of the kit was the fact that it had no dynamic range. It was not velocity sensitive. No matter how hard or how soft that you'd hit, you'd hear the same sound at the same volume. Later on, the DP5 drum set would release and sell for about $550. So moving ahead to Dynacord, they released the P20 drum module. This was like an upgraded rack-mounted version of the Pecuter S. It had cartridge slots, but also featured 24 built-in sounds as well. The primary feature they talked about was MIDI integration, which was still relatively new at the time. The whole PD20 drum set cost about $2,500 at the time, which was probably a list price. There was also the Mini P, a small drum module with built-in pads on the top. It featured some cartridge slots so you could change the sounds if you wanted. In 1987, Roland released its first MIDI interface for electronic drums, the PM16 pad MIDI interface. This unit featured 16 pad inputs and no internal sounds. As you can see from this advertisement photo, even though you could buy it separately, you could also buy it as part of a full drum set. Here, it's paired with the new PD31, PD21, and PD11 pads that came out this year as well. The Roland PD31 pad featured 4 zones, a large center one and 3 rim zones. The number 31 stands for 3 plus 1 zones. I purchased the PD11 and the PD31 pads, and I found out that the kick drum suffers from a common yellowing problem that many other users have run into. This is not only a common problem with the Roland kick drum, but plastics in general from the 90s and the 80s. Thankfully, you can turn it back to its original color with products such as Retro Bright. For the longest time, I thought I had purchased the kick and snare from the Roland Alpha drum set, It's very easy to confuse these pads with the ones that originally came out on the Roland Alpha or DD30 line of drums. But it turns out I just bought these pads that were the generation beyond that. I'm not sure if they were ever actually paired with the DDR30 module that was part of that Roland Alpha system or not. But I do know for sure it was sold with that new MIDI interface that Roland came out with in 1987. In 1987, Simmons released the Mallet Station, a competitor to the Mallet Cat. But more importantly, this is also the year that Simmons released possibly the most ambitious electronic drum set of all time, the Simmons SDX. One thing to mention about that date though is that according to Modern Drummer magazine, it wasn't widely available until about 1988. This drum set was incredibly expensive. It listed for about $9,990. But it was said to be sold for around $10,154. There were different pad and module configurations that raised or lowered the price. For an extra $900, you could bump up the 2 megabytes of RAM in the drum module to 8 megabytes. If you adjusted that for inflation, that would be an extra $2,000 to get 6 megabytes extra of RAM. They also offered a 20 megabyte hard drive for an extra $1,750, the largest hard drive that Simmons could source. Now, $10,000 sounds like a lot of money. But let's put this into perspective, because remember, this is 1987 and 1988 by the time it actually hits stores. Inflation is a giant factor. If sold today, the drum set would have cost $22,309, adjusted for inflation. If you threw a couple of more upgrades into the mix that Simmons offered, like the extra RAM, a bigger hard drive, and the sequencer update, now you're looking at a price tag of about $28,562. And since we're taking a look at some of Bill Bruford's footage, we gotta assume that this drum set is around the $30,000 price range because he's got probably the maxed out drum set plus a bunch of extra pads. He's got double the size of a normal kit here. All of the pricing stuff aside though, this drum set was incredibly ambitious for the technology available at the time. This is one of the more important electronic drum sets in history. As you'd probably guess, the main reason why the drum set was so expensive came down to the beast of a drum module that it had. The module could handle 16 pads plus a 3-stage hi-hat pedal. It controlled a 9-inch screen with a built-in trackball and 2 buttons. And of course another row of buttons underneath the front of the screen that could be assigned to do different things, including auditioning every zone of every pad. This was a full-blown computer. It had menus, you could load it in a floppy drive, and the depth of features forced Simmons to write a 285-page manual just to try to explain it. So here's a few things the drum set could do. There was a full-screen digital mixer to control the sound decay, pitch, volume, and panning. The module let you set trigger curves. There was a built-in sample editor. The module could handle 16-bit audio. There was an optional internal hard drive to bring in more sounds. There was a built-in sequencer. The pads, except for the hi-hat and kick drum, were 3 zones. It could handle 3 velocity stacks with 3 sounds in each stack. What this means is that you could have up to 9 sounds for the pad depending on where and how you hit the pad. But in another twist, the snare had a 4th zone, the rim. So the snare could max out at 12 sounds instead of 9. Each of the sounds could be tuned and volume adjusted. Plus the module let you adjust the threshold for each velocity stack. Not only that, but you could affect the sound that you were listening to depending on where you hit the pads. Roland was not the first to do positional sensing. Simmons gave you 15 positional sensing pads back in the 80s. Hitting different parts of the pad with different levels of force would change the volume, the pitch, the brightness, the panning, the noise elements, or the starting point. The pads didn't use piezos, but instead sheets of FSR sensors. For various reasons, FSR sensors in electronic drums was and still is fairly rare. This sensor allowed the pads to have 128 concentric areas. There was also a variable 3-degree hi-hat pedal. The cymbals were chokeable, and the module had a 16-bit polyphony, the best for the time. To make up for the fact that there was only a 16-note polyphony, Simmons had a module trick. The module would cut off only the quietest sound that was ringing out when the polyphony maxed out, so hopefully you wouldn't even notice. This was called voice robbing. Again, it's really easy to compare these drum sets to drum sets from today, which would have like a 64-note polyphony, but back then, this was very good. Danny Carey and Bill Bruford were both known to use this system. For about 10 years, the Simmons SDX was the pinnacle of electronic drum technology. It's almost impossible to go that long as the king of electronic drums today. But unfortunately, making this drum set really hurt the company. Research and development costs were about £2 million, and no one really bought the SDX. Simmons only built about 250 of them, and they were so expensive no one really bought them. It's projected that the Simmons SDX lost the company about £1 million. To be honest, the timing of this kit was off by about 3 years. Simmons designed the most expensive electronic drum set in history just as E-drums were hitting a slump that would last for years. In just the first 4 years of the company, they had grown from 10 employees to 140. with a huge R&D department cranking out innovation after innovation. But unfortunately, starting in 1987, Simmons would have to become a smaller, leaner company to balance with the dwindling sales. According to Mr. Simmons, the image of the company was still tied to the Simmons SDS-5, the drum set that had made them so famous and propelled the whole electronic drum set industry. But now, the initial fad era of electronic drums was passing. Not even a groundbreaking electronic drum set could sustain the previous heights the company had enjoyed. Also, he surmised in a later Digital Drummer magazine interview that possibly the company had moved too fast with the introduction of the SDS-X. Drummers really didn't know what to make of the new kit and wondered why it cost more than their car. Maybe if they had slowly innovated year after year, that would have produced a better result at a smaller cost. But again, this is all armchair quarterback stuff. But Simmons was not out of the fight yet. And just as a side note, Simmons had made the hexagon shape so popular that even Zildjian was stamping them onto their cymbals. Okay, so let's move ahead to a less known electronic drum company. In 1987, Tectonic released the Tectonic's 2000 bass drum trigger plate. This is possibly the first kick drum trigger that you could add to most kick drum pedals. It sold for about $125. They also produced the Beatmaster drum triggers, which cost about $40 each. The company Trigger Perfect was founded by Mike Snyder in 1986. The first trigger was the DT1. Moving ahead to 1987, they produced the SC10. Mike had initially worked with Bill Katowski on the triggering aspect of the drum cat before starting his own company. According to a book he wrote called All About Electronic Percussion, within a few years, Trigger Perfect was the largest producer of electronic drum triggers. Of course, the company made their own branded triggers, but they also produced drum triggers for Roland and Cat Inc. Trigger Perfect is now owned by Pintec. Mike Snyder would go on to work for Roland and a few decades later, ATV. In 1988, Material Innovations released the Igniter pads. These were very simple rectangles that came in many different colors. They were about 6 by 8 inches across and 2 inches deep. The rubber was a very soft rubber gel type playing surface. Pricing is kind of difficult to nail down because in one magazine they said they were selling for about $78 a piece, but another one said that 4 pads was $600, or 8 for $1,000. They also sold a mod so that these pads could work with the Roland Octapad. They later updated the pads to the Igniter 2, which were a little bit bigger and made a kick drum trigger and a hi-hat pedal in 1990. This was their final product. Rest in peace, Material Innovations. 2 years after its initial release, Yamaha updated its electronic drum offerings with the PMC-1 system. This was the successor to the D8 drum set. Instead of a drum module, it came with a MIDI interface. This would be their last drum set to be released in the 80s. The drum set was not particularly loved compared to the competition at the time, unfortunately. In 1988, Roland released a successor to the Roland Octapad called the Roland Pad 80, or the Octapad 2. This was a big improvement over an already successful pad. It had 3-note layering that you could trigger all at once or depending on how hard that you hit. You could bend the pitch and now patch chains. On the downside, the playing surface on these zones were unchanged from the original Octapad. They were really hard and they were pretty loud too. List price was about $800. In 1988, Simmons made a competitor to the Roland Octapad line called the Simmons Portakit and also the Simmons Drum Station. But that's not quite accurate because the drum station was announced but got canceled before release. The Portakit was larger than the Roland Octapad 2 and had nicer feeling pads. Those tiny zones on the bottom were really hard to hit though unless you were very accurate. You could also plug in external pads. Simmons attempted to make this easier by giving the Portakit module the ability to analyze waveforms of incoming trigger signals and make adjustments for better accuracy. It wasn't perfect, but it gave it an edge over the competitors. As far as weaknesses go, it couldn't do sound layering, and the buttons were really painfully hard to press. List price was about $1,000. That same year, Simmons released the Simmons Trixer. It was a complete hybrid system. It came with a drum module featuring sounds from the excellent Simmons SDX library, and a full set of drum bug acoustic drum triggers that attach to drum heads. We see this strategy a lot with electronic drum companies. You release a really nice flagship drum module, in this case the Simmons SDX, and then you slowly trickle down different features and sounds from that into lower priced offerings. In 1988, Clavia introduced the D-Drum 2. These pads were not much different than the previous entry, but the module was an all-new design. It used a cartridge system called the Sound Pack. In addition to the sounds included in the module, there were 11 extra cards sold separately that you could buy for about 80 pounds each. This is one of the earlier kits to attack the machine gunning problem inside of drum modules, with what D-Drum called their drum head vibration algorithm. Something cool the module could do was trigger multiple sounds at once from different cartridges. You can even pan the sounds in different directions from each other. There, of course, was also a good selection of effects, pitch bending at your fingertips, and also individual outs, which made this very useful for live gigs. Reviews from different magazines at the time saw this kit as a breath of fresh air. The module was easy to use, decent sounds, and nice feeling pads. As far as downsides go, the module was only 8 channels, and the drum set was very expensive. In the United States, it listed for about $6,780, and in the UK, it listed for about £3,215. The module by itself was incredibly expensive. It cost about £2,295. If you inflation adjusted that, it would be about £6,000 today, or about $7,700 in 2020. But aside from the pricing stuff, this was a very capable drum set that people liked. In 1988, Korg released the DRM-1 digital rhythm module. And moving over to EMU, I'm not exactly sure on the exact year, but they released the SP1200 sampling percussion system. This year, Dynacord produced a sequel to the flagship Add-1 module, called the Add-2. It was 16-bit and had a floppy drive. It bumped up the sampling capacity from 40 seconds up to 95 seconds, which is pretty impressive. This module seems to be a little bit harder to track down on the used market. I don't think they sold quite as many as they did with the Add-1 module. Unfortunately, I believe this is the last new product that Dynacord would produce in the e-drum market. Rest in peace, Dynacord. Wait, just so you know, Dynacord isn't actually gone. They still exist, they specialize in speaker systems and even produce stuff for stadiums. Just no drums anymore. Okay, so let's move ahead to 1989. How's Simmons doing here at the end of the decade? Well, unfortunately, according to Modern Drummer magazine, things had gotten kind of bad over at Simmons, and they initially announced they were going out of business. But after some radio silence, Simmons came through with a new release, the SDS 2000. The drum set had 40 sounds from the flagship SDX drum set and a suite of 30 digital effects that you could assign to the different pads. The module was also expandable. There were also a couple of other Simmons releases. One was the Simmons Drum Hugger. This was a hybrid pad that was meant to attach to the rim of an acoustic drum. I really like this concept, and we haven't seen much like it since. Simmons also released the ADT. This is a rack-mountable hybrid drum trigger interface that produces MIDI notes, so you can use it with whatever kind of drum machine or module that you want, and a set of triggers or pads. Those were the different products that Simmons released this year, and in general, Simmons was working hard to reestablish its customer base as the whole electronic drum industry slowly went to a slump for a few years. Let's move ahead to a company that got a lot of people excited about electronic drums, and that's Heart Dynamics. The first drum set from this company was the Heart Systems Occupad in 1989. The first iteration came with Remo-coated ambassador heads, and there were 2 versions of the pad, the Occupad 1 and 2. They sold for about $219 and $269, the main difference being the number of zones. The drum pads came in multiple colors and were 10 inches across. According to a review in Modern Drummer magazine in 1991, it was said that they weren't incredibly sensitive at tight drumhead tensions, but responded better at looser drumhead tensions, at least the original version. These issues would be fixed later on. The kick drum pad was a rubber tower that cost about $319. Rick Allen of Def Leppard used them for many years before eventually switching to Yamaha and Pintec. In 1989, Roland made the Pad 5 hand pad for about 160 pounds. As the name basically says, it came with 5 total pads, 3 large ones and 2 small ones. It was a MIDI controller designed to be used with a MIDI-equipped drum module or drum machine. Roland also released the R8M, the total percussion sound module, which had sounds from the Roland R8 human rhythm drum machine. Let's talk about DW. This pad is more of a footnote in electronic drum history, but I thought I'd mention it anyway because I was unaware that DW made an electronic drum pad. It was designed by Terry Bozzio with some help from Dom Lombardi. It's a 3-zone pad with 3 1/4-inch connections on the back of the unit. In 1989, Drastic came out with a small, skinny multipad that had 4 zones. It sold for about $250, and Tommy Lee from Motley Crue is known to play it, or was known to play it. In 1989, AD Speaker Systems released the Speakers Rock Blocks. These were 4-sided pads and featured a kick drum pad that was designed like a post with a small square trigger surface on the top of it. Something that we're seeing a lot from different companies. This kit came with 8 pads and didn't have a drum module. It sold for a surprisingly expensive $895 list price. That same year, the DrumCat 2.0 software was announced. It was free, but you had to pay for shipping. It expanded MIDI functionality, letting you name each kit, added a sequencer, expanded tap tempo functionality, and trigger interaction suppression. In 1989, Pintec was founded. This is one of the very few electronic drum companies from the 80s that has survived all the way to this day, although it has been bought and sold a few different times over the years. In 1989, LP introduced the LP Spikes. These were compact bar triggers that were self-isolating, supposedly for better triggering, and they were made of a soft, rubber-coated polycarbonate shell. Alright, so let's take a break from the main timeline to talk about Soviet-era electronic drums. The best summary I could find about this situation is from the website Samples from Mars, speaking about synthesizers from the Soviet Union at this time. I'm going to quote it here in a second, and pretty much everything he's saying here applies to the electronic drums that the USSR was also producing at the time. In the 1970s, there was no real audio industry in the USSR. The state controlled almost all aspects of production, and there were no bespoke music technology companies to create the instruments that Russian electronic musicians would use. Instead, state-owned plants would simply manufacture equipment as part of a broad program to increase the overall volume of goods produced for the people. A plant would manufacture anything from military-grade radios to, you guessed it, synthesizers. As a result, many of these synths are built literally like tanks. They were cold, heavy, and able to take and give a beating. Fortunately, many of Russia's brightest engineers were quite passionate about music technology and designed their own versions of synths to contribute to the state's quota of manufactured goods, despite the lack of demand for them. The average Soviet citizen really couldn't afford them. Since American and Japanese gear was hard to come by, these engineers would literally borrow synths from touring Western bands in order to learn the technologies and incorporate them into their synth designs. So basically what we have here are a collection of different electronic drum sets that are copies of brands like Simmons, but they are actually different companies, the state-owned production of everything. During my research for this video, I came across some eBay listings for different drums from this era, so I bought one of the Marsh pads. Different electronic drums were made by these massive factories until maybe around 1991. There's also a free drum plugin which features sounds from one of these modules that you can actually download. The best website to learn more about each of these drums is rustkeys.net. It's an online museum of instruments from the USSR. So while we're on the topic of countries that don't really come to mind when you think of vintage electronic drums, let's talk about Brazil. They actually had some electronic drum companies back in the 1980s, and I almost was not aware of this until a lucky post that I read over on the Vintage Electronic Drum Facebook group. So big thank you to Daniel for sending me down this rabbit hole. There were 3 electronic drum companies I'm aware of from this era of electronic drums in Brazil: Pitch, Bertazzi, and IS Digidrums, or possibly Is Digidrums. I'm not 100% convinced on my pronunciation of these names, so bear with me. Pitch was a very limited drum brand. You had one tone, and then the drum brain let you control the pitch of that sound, thus the name. Bertazzi was much better. It came in 2 and 5 channels and had more sound controls. And then finally, IS Digidrums is said to have been a higher-end electronic drum company from Brazil in the 1980s. While doing research for this video, I contacted one of the owners of Bertazzi Drums, so here's what he had to say about the history of his company. I'm one of the Bertazzi brothers. At the time, I wanted to have a Simmons electronic drum set, but I didn't have any money. My brother trained in electronics and I in design. We assembled the first prototype and named it the Bertazzi Drum System 2 or 5, depending on the number of pads. You can see me playing with the first prototype in this video. At the time, we had a change in the economy that favored several projects. We had an excellent 2 years of the company. Unfortunately, in 1988, the country's economic policies led many companies to ruin. We stayed for some time, producing pads, sound consoles, and guitar amplifiers. But little by little, we had no way to continue. It was a very difficult time in Brazil. The company's activities ended in 1999. So as you can tell from all these different photos, most of these electronic drums were, inspired by Simmons, just like we saw over in the Soviet Union. I do want to point out that there are probably other countries other than the Soviet Union and Brazil that also produced electronic drums that most people aren't aware of. Maybe some stuff happening in China, maybe some stuff happening in Africa, but that is the extent of my knowledge when it comes to 1980s era electronic drums. Alright, let's do a post-mortem of the 1980s. This was a very complicated decade, a lot was going on, fortunes were made and lost, and the sounds were iconic. You've probably also noticed that the playing surfaces of these drums got better and better as the years went on, albeit from a very bad starting point. MIDI was invented in the 80s, and you cannot downplay the contribution that MIDI has had to electronic drums. Now on the downside, really only the first half of the 80s could really be considered a golden age of electronic drums. Also, electronic drums were 110% a fad at this time. It was all driven by music that was popular. and as soon as music tastes changed, the entire electronic drum market kind of fell apart. Eventually what we would see is a compromise. Triggers and hybrid setups would appear, so you could play acoustic drums with triggers or at least with a couple of pads to the side when you needed certain sounds. Alright, let's jump ahead to the forgotten decade of electronic drums, the 90s. That's it for this episode. The next one should be coming out fairly soon. Big shout out to the people on Patreon who helped make this possible. If you want to learn more about the history of electronic drums in written form, here are the books and magazines that I used as sources throughout making this series. As far as books go, the best two books are Electronic DrumFax and The Complete Simmons Drum Guide by Alex Graham. He's the only one currently making books on the history of electronic drums, and I came back to these time and time again throughout making this series. I highly recommend both of them. Also, The Complete Simmons Drum Book by Bob Henrit, All About Electronic Percussion by Mike Snyder, and Electronic Drums Period were also helpful. As far as magazines, there are a ton of them that are no longer in print, but you can go read them yourself on this website right here. I found it to be very, very helpful to read reviews of electronic drums from the perspective of someone in the 80s. I don't know if I could have made this series without the help of all these different magazines. The most important one out of all of them, though, was Modern Drummer Magazine. They've been publishing stuff since the 70s, and I ended up reading pretty much all of them that I could until about 2007 in order to make this series. This magazine was hugely helpful during the 80s and also the 90s portion of this video series, because no one writes books or really anything about the 90s era of electronic drums, so there's a bit of a dead space, a lack of information for that period of electronic drum history. Also, during the research phase of this video, I ended up contacting various people that work at different electronic drum companies. I purchased a small collection of vintage electronic drums, and of course I also referenced pretty much every clip of vintage electronic drum footage on YouTube that I could get my hands on. As you can see, the documentary series has taken an enormous amount of work, so I appreciate you watching all the way to the end of the video. See you in a few.